Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to Chapter 19. We're going to talk about the cardiovascular system. This is part 1, where we're really just going to cover some basic definitions, talk about the chambers of the heart, the vessels of the heart, and then in part 2, we'll get into more physiology. Chapter, we're going to focus on the cardiovascular system. We're going to talk about the heart and the blood vessels. And hopefully we remember that the main goal of the cardiovascular system is to transport blood through the body. Remember, we need oxygen and we need nutrients. We're going to make ATP, right, so that we can carry out cellular functions. We also need to remove our waste. So these are things we're going to exhale. And in conjunction with transporting that blood, you have to provide adequate perfusion. So that basically delivery of blood, right? So you have to make sure blood is getting all the way from your heart to your fingertips, right? Your fingers and toes. So adequate perfusion, sufficient delivery of blood with those nutrients in order to maintain a cell's health. Some basic terms here for blood vessels. An artery carries blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back to the heart. You can think of it as returning to the heart. And capillaries are the site of gas exchange. So if I'm dropping off oxygen or I'm picking up CO2 or the other way around, right? So between blood and air in the lungs, you're going to take in the oxygen and you're going to exhale the CO2, right? Between the blood and the body cells, the blood's going to drop off oxygen and it's going to pick up the waste from the body cells. Lots of times people will say veins are blue, right? It's carrying deoxygenated blood. That is not always true. They're not always deoxygenated. What does the term actually mean? A vein is any vessel that's carrying blood back to the heart. An artery is any vessel that's carrying blood away from the heart. So we'll see the exceptions to this when we see the pulmonary system. A nice image for you. They're showing you the capillaries and what the capillary beds look like. And this is kind of a good example here. We see this artery and this vein, and this right here is the capillary bed, and that's where the actual exchange is going to happen. Basically, there are two sides of the heart, so sometimes they call it a side-by-side pump. You're going to have blood entering on the right side, and you're going to have blood exiting on the left side. So the right side is going to receive the deoxygenated blood, so that means it's low oxygen, high CO2. And then the left side is going to receive oxygenated blood, so it's going to be high in oxygen, low in CO2. So the atria are the upper chambers, the ventricles are the lower chambers or inferior chambers. You can see this image is a little bit better. They're showing you all the deoxygenated blood entering the right side. And this is blood coming to the right side. It's going to go out to the lungs. And so we said deoxygenated, low oxygen, high CO2. So what happens when it goes to the lungs? It's going to drop off the CO2 and it's going to pick up the oxygen in the air. And all of that blood, that oxygenated blood, is going to come back to the left side. And then eventually we're going to pump it to the aorta and then out to the body. When we look at the vessels that enter the heart, they call them the great vessels, and you should know which vessels, which great vessels are delivering blood and which ones are taking blood away, and then specifically which cavity. So the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, and you'll see me abbreviate these a lot, right? So these are all going to drain into the right atrium. So you're going to have the inferior, superior, and then you're going to have your right atrium. And then you're going to have your right ventricle, you're going to have your left atrium, and you're going to have your left ventricle. The pulmonary trunk transports blood from the right ventricle. So coming out to the lungs is going to be the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary veins are going to deliver oxygenated blood back to the left atrium, and then the aorta up here from the left ventricle out to the aorta. You can see better images, better drawings, right? Here's the superior vena cava, here's the inferior vena cava. So all of the blood from lower than the heart and all of the blood from above the heart is going to be deposited into the right atrium. Then it's going to travel into the right ventricle. Then it's going to travel into the pulmonary trunk. Where is it leading to? Pulmonary trunk leads to the lungs. We're going to drop off CO2, we're going to pick up oxygen, and then oxygenated blood from both of your lungs is going to be deposited in the left atrium. Then it's going to go down to the left ventricle, and then it's going to go out the aorta, and this is going to go to the body. Now we have to look at the valves. There are sets of valves between the atria and the ventricles, and then from the ventricles to the great vessels, either the aorta or the pulmonary trunk. So AV valves, atrioventricular, right? So they're between the atrium and the ventricles. We have the right AV valve, the left AV valve. We still use these names, tricuspid and bicuspid. You can use whichever terminology you like. Some people still use the mitral valve for the left. The valves that sit between the ventricles and the arterial trunks, or the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, those are called semilunar, and they tell you where they're leading to, right? So pulmonary semilunar is leading to the pulmonary trunk. Aortic semilunar is leading to the aorta. This right here is the right AV valve, or tricuspid. I still use tricuspid and bicuspid. I'll take either answer, but just so that you know what I'm talking about, right? So this is the bicuspid, and you're going to see the tricuspid has 3 attachments and the bicuspid has 2 attachments. A student one time said you always want to try something before you buy something. So the tricuspid comes first. It's on the right side. And then you can see in yellow there the semilunar valves. So the pulmonary leads from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic semilunar valve right here leads from the left ventricle to the aorta. So we've said that the heart is a side-by-side pump, right? We have all of the deoxygenated blood coming in the right side, and then we have the oxygenated blood leaving the left side. So they break up the circulation into pulmonary and systemic, and there's a reason why we have to know the difference. It has to do with pressure differences, but for right now you can see pulmonary circulation, deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart goes to the lungs. At the lungs, the blood's going to pick up oxygen and it's going to release carbon dioxide, and then it's going to go back to the left side. So here we're talking about you're in the right atrium, you're going to the right ventricle, you're going through the pulmonary trunk, you're going out to the lungs, right? You're dropping off CO2, you're picking up oxygen, and then that blood is going back to the left atrium. For the systemic circulation, this is, if you see systemic, this is whole body. Think of body. I'm not sure if you remember that term from when we talked about the nervous system, but systemic circulation is the body. So this is oxygenated blood from the left side of the heart, right, to all of the systemic cells. So all, skin, muscle, right? And this is where we're going to drop off the oxygen and the nutrients and pick up the waste. So here you can see that the right side of the heart, you're going to the lungs, drop off to the left side of the heart, then you go to the systemic tissue, and then back to the heart again. So it's probably a little confusing right now. Let's look at another picture. Here's the pulmonary circuit. So all of the deoxygenated blood, right? Low oxygen, high CO2, all of that travels on the right side of the heart. It goes out to the lungs. It's going to drop off the CO2, and we're going to pick up oxygen. All of that oxygen is going to travel back to the heart to the left side, left atrium, left ventricle. Then it's going to go up to the aorta, and off of the aorta is what you're going to use to feed all of the body tissues. The point that they're trying to drive home with this is that the pulmonary circuit is very short. You're just going from the heart out to the lungs and back. The systemic circuit, you're going from the heart all the way out to your fingers and toes, the top of your head, right? So the systemic circuit is a lot longer. You have to have higher pressure in order for the blood to make it all the way to the fingers and the toes. Pulmonary circuit, shorter, less pressure needed, right? We just have to go next door. We have to go from the heart to the lungs and back. So what happens if your heart is not pumping effectively, right? If somehow it's impaired, it's probably going to lead to edema or swelling. And think of it more as the system backs up. So if you have right ventricle impairment, so we're right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. So let's say this is not working. Where did this fluid come from? Where did this blood come from? It came from the right atrium. Where did the right atrium come? Either inferior vena cava or superior vena cava, right? So you're going to have a body-wide systemic edema or swelling. If your left ventricle is impaired, here, where does it back up to? Left atrium. Where did the blood from the left atrium, how did it get there? It came from the lungs. So you're going to see lung edema if something's wrong with the left ventricle. Just to look quickly at the location and position of the heart's enclosed in pericardium. It's within the thoracic cavity. It sits between the lungs in the mediastinum. So hopefully we remember the entire area is thoracic, right? So there's the thoracic. Then we break it down into specific. We have the pleural cavities. And then in the middle sternum, that's mediastinum. The most specific cavity, the smallest cavity you could put the heart into would be pericardial. It is slightly rotated. The right side is more front and the left side kind of tilts towards the back a little bit. It is a little left of the midline. And this one always throws people. The base is the top and the apex, is the bottom. So the base, apex. You can see the image here. They've kind of blocked out the sternum a little bit. You can see that the heart sits slightly to the left-hand side. You can see the pericardium, right? We can see the pleural cavities. We can see thoracic, and then the heart is in the pericardial. Hopefully you remember the terminology parietal pericardium and visceral pericardium from 201. So basically it's a serous membrane layer that wraps around the heart. There's an inner layer and an outer layer and a cavity in between. You may remember that serous, that it's a watery fluid-filled sac, and it helps reduce friction. Remember, your heart's beating constantly, your lungs are right next door, and they're constantly inflating and deflating. So you're going to wrap all of these organs in this serous membrane layer, double layer system, help reduce friction, reduce heat. The one we probably have not talked about before is that there is a fibrous pericardium. This is the outermost covering, and it really acts to anchor the heart and prevent overfilling. And we'll talk more about this when we move into talking about pressure differences. But this one you can definitely think about right now. If your heart is constantly moving, do you want it to kind of move around within the thoracic cavity? No, you want to anchor it. And there's a good image coming up next. So here is that fibrous pericardium, and you can see that it's anchored here where the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries meet. You can see it's anchored here where the aorta, here where we have the superior vena cava. So just kind of stops the heart from shifting or moving and keeps all of the great vessels right where they need to be. And then you can see there is the parietal pericardium, that's the outermost layer. Then you can see there's a cavity filled with serous fluid. And then we have an inner layer, which is called the visceral pericardium, also known as epicardium. And then we actually get into the muscle. So we'll talk more about this coming up in just a second. So you have fibrous pericardium, then you have fibrous pericardium, parietal pericardium, a cavity-filled space with serous fluid, then you have visceral pericardium or epicardium. You can have inflammation of the pericardium. So you can have some sort of pathogen that gets in. And remember, if we're doing inflammation, we're increasing capillary permeability. Remember diapedesis? We're having fluid accumulate in that pericardial cavity, and this could restrict the heart's movement. The heart might not be able to pump as well, or the muscle might not be able to contract as well to make the heart pump as well. So basically think about fluid, extra fluid on your heart, right? We can also have friction rub. So sometimes the pericardial layers will kind of rub together, especially if there's any sort of inflammation, and you'll hear like a crackling sound when somebody is breathing in and breathing out. Here we're looking at an anterior view of the external anatomy. I just wanted to show you that since we do sit slightly left, or the heart sits slightly left, and that the atria are smaller than you think. So this would be the right atrium, this would be the right ventricle, this would be the left atrium, this would be the left ventricle. On the back side, it's nice to see how these vessels would pool together. You cannot see this area if you're looking at an anterior view, so I'm showing you this posterior view, so you can see that the vessels that come from the lungs, so you have lung, this is where we picked up oxygen, we dropped off CO2, and then all of that blood is going to pool here and enter into the left atrium. It's also nice here on this side. You can see superior vena cava, you can see inferior vena cava. It's going to pool and enter into the right atrium. We do have this structure called coronary sulcus. This is going to separate the atria from the ventricles. So it's kind of a groove that extends around the heart. And then we're going to see these interventricular sulci. Right, so remember, if you remember, sulcus was a shallow groove. So we're going to see anterior interventricular, posterior interventricular. These grooves are going to contain coronary vessels that supply blood to the heart wall. And when we say heart wall, hopefully we're thinking muscles of the heart. So if you see a coronary vessel, they're saying this is a vessel that feeds the heart or feeds heart muscle. If we look at a transection and you can see the muscle of the ventricles, they want you to realize that the left ventricle has much thicker wall than the right ventricle. So this has something to do with the difference between the pulmonary circulation and the systemic, right? So where does the right side go to? The right ventricle goes up the pulmonary trunk, out the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. That was your pulmonary circuit. Right? Remember how I said it was short? It doesn't need to be pushed very hard, so it's low pressure. So does it make sense that the muscle is smaller? Yes. The left side has to generate high pressure to force the blood. Remember, this left ventricle blood is going and that is systemic circuit, or systemic circulation. That has to be under really high pressure because we have to go all the way from the heart all the way out to the fingers, the toes, and the top of the head. If we look at the inside of the heart, so we talked about the layers outside of the heart that reduce friction and heat. Now I'm talking about the inner layers at least these two, right? So we did talk about epicardium. That's the visceral pericardial layer. That's the outermost layer of the heart. It's simple squamous epithelium. It has to have connective tissue underneath. Remember, the connective tissue is vascular, so it's going to feed that epithelium layer. The myocardio, hopefully you're seeing myo and you're thinking muscle, so myocardium is going to be the cardiac muscle tissue. That's what's actually going to contract to pump blood. And then we have this internal lining, so this internal surface, and this endocardium is also made up of simple squamous epithelium. It has areolar connective tissue underneath. Hopefully that makes sense. And this is continuous with the lining of the vessels. So think of having a nice smooth surface as the blood is flowing through all of the vessels and the heart. If you wanted to see kind of this side view, I think this is nice because you can see how thick the myocardium is. So lots more muscle than anything else, but that you do have this endocardium layer where you're going to have a simple squamous. It's the most internal. Then you're going to have the connective tissue, then the muscle. Then you're going to have more areolar connective tissue and adipose, and then you're going to have simple squamous on the outside. So kind of this sandwich view is, simple squamous, areolar connective tissue, then we're going to have cardiac muscle, then we're going to have adipose, again, connective tissue, either adipose or areolar, and then we're going to have simple squamous epithelium again. You have separation between the chambers, so there is going to be a wall or a separation division between the right atria and the left, and the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So an interatrial septum, that would be between the two atria. Interventricular, that would be between the two ventricles. In the right atrium, you are going to have muscles, these pectinate muscles. These are ridges on the anterior wall. We'll see an image of those in just a second. We're also going to see that the coronary sinus, so again, anything that says coronary, this is the blood that was either feeding the heart muscle or it's the return, right? The waste blood that's low in oxygen coming back to the coronary sinus. The right atrium exits to the right ventricle through the right AV valve. We also call it the tricuspid valve. The right ventricle, we're going to see some irregular muscle ridges inside the ventricle wall. We're going to see some papillary muscles. They're kind of cone-shaped projections. They act as an anchor, so they're going to help anchor these tendinous cords. These are thin strands of collagen fibers that are attaching to the AV valves. So the right ventricle is going to exit to the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary semilunar valve. Left atrium exits to the left ventricle through the AV valve. The left ventricle exits to the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. Basically, we've been walking through it the whole time. They just kind of put it into words for you. So do we know superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, both dump into the right atrium? They're telling you that this fossa ovalis used to be a hole in fetal development. We'll come back and talk about that when we do a reproduction chapter. But imagine if the fetal heart is developing in utero, it's getting mom's blood supply. Its heart can have this opening between the two atria, and it actually helps circulate blood through the fetus, but that hole has to close right around the time that they're born, either before. Some children, it doesn't happen until a couple of days after, but that hole has to close once the child is no longer using mom's blood supply, once the fetus is born, right? All right, so superior vena cava, inferior vena cava dumping into the right atrium. We're going to go through the tricuspid valve or the right AV valve. We're going to go to the right ventricle. We're going to travel through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk. We're going to go out the pulmonary arteries. Why is it artery? Because it's going away from the heart. And we're going out to the lungs. We're going to drop off the waste, right? Drop off the CO2, and we're going to pick up oxygen. The oxygenated blood from both lungs gets deposited into the left atrium. It goes through the bicuspid valve, or the left AV valve, and then it travels into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it's going to travel through the aortic semilunar valve and come around and exit the aorta. So here you can see some of these tendinous cords from the valves and how we have these ridges of muscles, right? These projections of muscles. So you see how every muscle projection, there's a cord or a tendon from the either tricuspid or bicuspid valve. So you could imagine there's probably some sort of pulling, right? Pulling open and then shutting. These valves ensure one-way blood flow. We do not want backflow into the atria. So we have right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. So the blood goes from the right atrium into the right ventricle. We want this right ventricle blood to go out to the lungs, right? We do not want the blood to backflow. So this valve has to be open when we send the blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle, but the valve has to close when the right ventricle contracts, because where do we want the blood to go from the right ventricle? We want it to go through the pulmonary semilunar valve. So we want it to go up and out. We don't want it to backflow into the atria. Same thing on the left side, right? On the left side here, we do not want the blood to backflow. We want the blood that's in the left ventricle to go through the aortic valve, semilunar valve, and into the aorta. So again, just explaining why semilunar valves, same thing, we don't want backflow. So the semilunar valves are open when the ventricles contract. So if my right ventricle, I'm going to do this for contracting. If my right ventricle is contracting, I want the blood pushed out to the lungs, right? So the valve here, the semilunar valve, which is the pulmonary semilunar valve. Remember those, the semilunars are named after where they're going. We want that valve to be open. So the blood can go from the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve, out the pulmonary trunk to the lungs. We want it to close when we're trying to fill up the right ventricle. So when the ventricles relax, the right atria is going to dump blood into the right ventricle. We don't want that valve to be open until the ventricle is going to contract. Another transverse section that I think is kind of interesting, they're showing you the coronal or frontal section, and then here they're showing you the difference between the semilunar valves. So you can see they kind of form these half circles. There's 3 of them, but you can't see it unless you're actually looking at the image this way. And then you can see why this is the tri and this is the bi, right? So bicuspid has 2 and tricuspid has 3. And when you're looking at them, you can see here on the right ventricle, when you're looking at this tricuspid or right AV valve, here's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. This image here is showing you the mechanism of action. So they want you to see that the AV valve is open. So we're going from the atrium to the ventricle. So let's say we are on the right side, yeah. So right atrium here, blood is flowing into the right ventricle. This valve has to be open, right? If it's not open, the blood won't flow from the atria to the ventricle. Once the blood is all filling in the ventricle, the pressure kind of causes this valve to close. So now there's no backflow. For the semilunar valve, same thing happens. If we're here in the ventricles, these ventricles, whether it's right or left, these ventricles, when they're pumping the blood, the semilunar valves have to be open. Once the blood reaches the vessel, then these semilunar valve flaps are going to close so that you don't have blood backflow into the ventricle. We have some of the common heart issues. Your heart can become enlarged, and this doesn't mean you can pump more blood. It's actually bad, right? So heart becomes enlarged and you have less forceful contractions. It has to do with the myofilaments. You remember the myosin and the actin. Basically, if the overlap isn't just right, if it's too stretched, you're not going to be able to have a forceful enough contraction to pump blood. And remember, from the left ventricle, that's really important because we're pumping blood out to our fingers and toes. You can also have the heart wall growing into the ventricle so that your ventricle holds less blood. So the less blood you hold, the less you can pump through the heart, the less blood's going to get to your fingers and toes. You can have a heart murmur, you can have leaky valves, you can have valves that don't close all the way and blood does backflow. You can have valves that kind of get stuck, right? They don't open completely, so then blood's not moving freely from the atria to the ventricles. This pathway of blood is something that I would work on and focus on. If you can get this first part down, then the part that we have to add to it will make your life a lot easier, right? So we're going to travel or follow the pathway of blood through the heart, but we're going to follow it as it goes out to each arm and out to each leg. So this is kind of just the first part. This is the first 50%. We're just going from the heart out to the lungs, back to the heart. And then we're going to add to it, either you're going to the right arm, right leg, left leg. So we'll talk more about that in lab. If you're looking here at the words, you should also be able to identify it on the model. I suggest you kind of memorize the words and then be able to go over to a model and point to each of these as the blood is flowing through. So memorization isn't bad. This is the first step, right? Then we'll have to think about the physiology and kind of the flow of blood, and we'll have some more critical thinking down the road. So here is the superior vena cava. Remember, this is draining from the head, right? So this is waist. This is high CO2, low oxygen. We have the inferior vena cava. So those are both depositing here. This is the right atrium. We move through the tricuspid to the right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar to the pulmonary trunk, and out the right and left pulmonary arteries. We go out to the lungs. We're going to drop off CO2, and we're going to pick up oxygen. Once we've picked up the oxygen, right, so now we've got high oxygen, that travels through the right and left pulmonary veins. Again, why is it veins? Because it's going back to the heart. Now we're in left atrium. We go through the bicuspid valve. We're in left ventricle. We travel through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. And all of these offshoots from the aorta are going to feed the systemic circulation. What's going to happen when we get to tissue? We're going to drop off the oxygen and we're going to pick up the CO2. This is a little wordy, but I wanted you to see that there is a fibrous skeleton. So there's kind of this structural support, these fibrous rings, this framework of the heart. So think of this as if you ever see a house getting framed, right? Framing of a house, framed house. It has no walls, right? It might not have a roof, but it has all of the 2x4s, all the studs, right? So this structural internal support. And then I'll mention the arrangement of the cardiac tissue. So the muscle cells are kind of spiraled in a bundle, and the atria kind of move around the top to squeeze down. So this is kind of a downward arrangement of muscle fibers. And for the ventricles, for ventricular contraction, it's more of a wringing of a mop, because you have to squeeze at the bottom and push the blood up against gravity through those semilunar valves into the great vessels. This image is showing you the fibrous skeleton. So they're kind of showing you how does everybody stay in its place. Remember, this is forceful contraction, so we have to have kind of this internal fibrous skeleton. The arrangements of the cardiac muscle. So just like your bicep brachii is arranged in a certain way, if you remember, we talked about convergent and we talked about bipinnate muscles, right? Circular muscles. So the arrangement of the muscle fiber bundles plays a role in what function that muscle can do or what kind of contraction that muscle is going to do. So you can see here at the top that the atria look like they get squeezed. And this should make sense because where's all the blood going? From the atria to the ventricles. So basically we just have to squeeze the sides and the top to push down. But remember the ventricles, the right ventricle is going out to the lungs and the left ventricle is going out the aorta. So we have to do a ringing motion. We have to be able to contract the cardiac muscle and squeeze at the same time to push up against gravity to get through the semilunar valves and into either the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. I put this in here if you want to go look at it. I think it's really interesting. They're actually looking at stripping all of the cells off of a heart and leaving that fibrous framework. And then they would repopulate the heart with your stem cells. So this would be a nice way around kind of transplanting hearts of somebody else. And you have to take immunosuppressant. We have to do the matching. Could we take kind of the framework of somebody else's heart, strip all the cells off, and then differentiate your cells, take your stem cells and turn them into your heart cells, put them back on the framework, and then give you this heart? And would it still function, and would your immune system think that it's yours? So now we have to talk about the coronary vessels. So these are the vessels that are actually going to feed the heart wall. So critical thinking. Does the blood that travels through the heart, so the blood that's going right atrium, right ventricle, out to the lungs, and then back to the left atrium, left ventricle, and then out to the body, if it's traveling through the heart chambers, does it actually feed the heart muscle? And the answer is no. So where does the oxygenated blood that feeds the heart muscle, where does it have to come from? So remember we said aorta is systemic. It feeds your entire body, right? You're going to have a coronary artery that comes off of the aorta. It's one of the very first arteries, and it's going to feed your heart muscle. So hopefully we know muscle has to get in oxygen and glucose so that it can generate ATP so that it can contract, right? So coronary circulation is what delivers the blood to the heart muscle. And we're going to see coronary arteries and we're going to see coronary veins. We're going to focus on the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. We're also going to look at the posterior interventricular artery and the anterior interventricular artery. We're not going to worry so much about some of the other branches of the heart. If you plan on specializing in cardiac care, then you might want to go ahead and learn all of them. Here we can see, I'm on the right side, this is the aorta, right? Remember the aorta has oxygenated blood. So one of the very first offshoots of the aorta is going to be the right coronary artery, and over here is going to be the left coronary artery. Be careful when you're looking in lab. This is the only part of it that you can see. You see how they've shaded out the rest of this? So the pulmonary trunk and the aorta are blocking it. You can only see this little piece of the left coronary artery. So you can see the right coronary artery comes off and it follows around the heart. And when we look at the back side, we'll talk about the posterior. You can see the left coronary artery splits. It goes around the back side as well, circumflex, and then we have one that runs down the front. So this anterior interventricular artery, it's a nice division line for the left ventricle and the right ventricle if you're looking at a whole heart. If you remember on the slide we just looked at, we saw the right coronary artery, right? And it came down, and then there were these branches that came off. They're all feeding the heart muscle at the right ventricle. And then we had our left coronary artery, and it went around, and we had these little branches that were coming off. So branching does exist in the coronary arteries, but it's too small to really feed or cover more than one area. So what I'm saying is this branching can feed this muscle and this muscle. This branch cannot perfuse enough, you can't get enough nutrients to travel over here and feed this area if that particular branch was blocked or occluded. So they're saying blockages, if you have any sort of blockage here in the right coronary artery or the left coronary artery, you are not going to get enough oxygen to that heart muscle, and that's going to cause problems. They're showing you this word arterial anastomoses or branching that we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about capillaries. So they're saying connections between vessels that allow the blood to get there by more than one route. So you could have an artery here and an artery here, and this artery feeds this tissue, and this artery is large enough that if something were to happen to this, the nutrients could diffuse and make up for the blockage or missing delivery of blood from another artery. So we'll talk about capillary beds and how they do form beds. There's lots of branching or lots of anastomoses. So just like we have coronary arteries, we have to have coronary veins that drain the heart muscle. So the high carbon dioxide, the low oxygen, the waste, that has to get back to the bloodstream to be dropped off at the lungs, right? So coronary veins are going to take the waste from the heart muscle, and they're going to dump it into the coronary sinus, so receives blood from the cardiac veins. That goes to the coronary sinus, and then that drains into the right atrium. So now it mixes with all the other blood, goes from the right atrium to the right ventricle, out to the lungs. We drop off all the waste, we pick up more oxygen, and come back. We're also going to look at the great cardiac vein. So here is the coronary sinus. You really can only see it on the back side. That's why it's kind of ghosted out here. So we have superior vena cava, we have inferior vena cava, and we have coronary sinus. All three of these are going to drain deoxygenated blood to the right atrium. On the back side, we have this middle cardiac vein. We have another important vein over here, the small cardiac vein, and the big one here, the great cardiac vein, and it runs right next to the anterior interventricular artery. So this is also a good hallmark. If you see, so that one is the anterior interventricular artery, and the great cardiac vein, that's how you know about where the left ventricle is located. So another clinical view slide, what's heart disease? Basically, if you have any sort of buildup of plaque in your coronary arteries. So remember, there's not a lot of branching, there's not a lot of overlap. If you're blocking a coronary artery, the parts of the heart muscle are not going to get blood and nutrients, right? You can also have heart pain if you have any sort of strenuous activity. Usually we're going to have you take nitroglycerin pills, right? Do immediate vascular dilation. Myocardial infarction, that's the anatomy term for heart attack. So this is some sort of sudden or complete occlusion of the coronary artery. The myocardium doesn't have oxygen. It could cause tissue death. And remember, cardiac muscle can't regenerate, right? So if you're damaging your cardiac muscle, it's not going to regrow. Can't do mitosis. So chest pain, weakness, shortness of breath, nausea, anxiety, sweating, probably going to trigger lots of adrenaline, right? Hormone production. Just to look at the microscope slides again, make sure we understand what cardiac muscle cells look like. So remember, they're short, they're branched, they can have one, sometimes two nuclei. They're going to be supported by areolar connective tissue. Remember that term sarcolemma? That's the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. We're going to call it sarcoplasmic reticulum. They have myofilaments, the myosin, right? Hopefully we remember our myosin and our actin. Myofilaments are thick and thin myofilaments. Remember, they have intercalated discs with gap junctions so that they can talk to each other. So remember, gap junctions allow for communication. So we're going to see at some point that the muscle has to contract all at one time in order to push the blood from the ventricles through the semilunar valves into those great vessels, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So you have to have a coordinated contraction. If the right side is contracting before the left side, or you have flutters in contraction, they aren't strong enough to push the blood, then the blood's not going to go anywhere. So you have kind of ineffectual pumping of your ventricles. So they have to be able to talk to each other, which is why we have gap junctions. Nice image here for you to look at. They're showing you the nucleus. They're showing you all the mitochondria that are in here. They're showing you the thick and thin myofilaments. They're showing you the T-tubules. And they're showing you these communication areas, these intercalated discs. So here are the gap junctions. If you wanted to look at it in kind of this long view, longitudinal view, remember we've got the proteins, the myosin and actin myofilaments. Again, you can see all of the mitochondria. Why do we have mitochondria? Why are there tons in muscle? Because this is where we generate the highest amount of ATPs, right? Aerobic respiration. So I would probably go back and look at aerobic respiration again, make sure that that makes sense to you. So last slide, kind of bottom line, cardiac muscle, high demand for energy. What type of fuel preferred? Glucose. What is it doing with the glucose? Aerobic metabolism. Why? Because this generates the most ATP. If oxygen is too low, you cannot do aerobic metabolism. You're not generating enough ATP. This low oxygen or ischemia or ischemic event is going to interfere with the heart muscle and cause cell death. Well, hopefully you had fun. I know there's lots of definitions. We're going to get into more physiology with part 2, so I'll talk to you soon. Bye.